and welcome to the last edition of the Libertarian Listener for this series and indeed 2020 as a whole. On today's show, I've been talking to SOFIA SVIHUROVA about the Great Reset and climate change, Christmas with COVID, the Brexit trade talks, and the prospects for 2021 and beyond. And at the end of the show, I'll be offering my thoughts on 2020 as a whole, what has been a very challenging year for libertarianism. So the first topic for today is on the Great Reset and climate change, and I've got a quote from Sky News here that says, "The UN Secretary General has called on all countries to declare a climate emergency or face catastrophic results. Nations at the UN summit were urged to stop the assault on the planet and increase their ambition on cutting the greenhouse gases that drive climate change. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned leaders the world was heading for a catastrophic 3 degrees of warming, as he urged them to declare a state of climate emergency in their countries until they become carbon neutral." Now, there seems to be a link between the UN's climate change agenda and the World Economic Forum's Great Reset. Why do you think that global leaders are backing such plans when neither seem particularly suited for the challenges the world faces today? Is it the intention to tax people into oblivion, or is it something else, since climate change for most people is a bottom of the list issue?
So I think the reason they are clumped together is because, at least the way it's presented, it's an issue that can't be dealt with on an individual basis. It has to be a united kind of approach and a global approach, I suppose, as the Great Reset kind of implies. And another big part of that is, bringing in the tax aspect of it that you mentioned. I think a lot of the time there's a big responsibility for kind of the developed Western countries to put their efforts into it and also support the little countries. I suppose because a huge part of the Great Reset agenda, as I've read about it, is to bring about a more of a global equality and lift up the poorer countries, and that's mentioned a lot in the climate change stuff as well. Like, it always mentions how, America and China are contributing to, rising sea levels because of our CO2 emissions and such. I think there's definitely an economic link as well. I'm not sure how malicious on purpose it is. I think there's definitely like this strange savior complex that these global leaders have. Kind of like the white man's burden revisited, if you like, but through an economic and climate change stance, I suppose. One of the interesting things I found yesterday when I was looking into it was I wanted to see which countries weren't included in the 38 that had declared a climate emergency. And one of them was Cuba, which I thought was quite, strange, because they're, at least from what I've heard, always hailed as like the only most sustainable economic system in the world. And they're like the most environmentally friendly and all of that. Yet they're not in a state of emergency, and they're not kind of they're not joining in with the rest of the countries. And one of the things that they said was that they do have some plans, but they need the foreign aid from other countries to fund these projects, and they're not ready to kind of put these forward until the rest kind of step up to do their bit. So I think the economic link is the most obvious one with the Great Reset and kind of the climate change aspect. And of course, carbon taxes and whatever else it is, subsidies of green energy solutions are the main thing for that.
Would it be too much to say that for the World Economic Forum to draw a link between climate change and COVID-19 is preposterous, since climate change is a pseudoscience with very little evidential basis, as global net carbon emissions have been declining for at least 5 years, and the hole in the ozone layer is actually repairing itself, and lockdowns and social distancing that have been implemented in many Western countries are equally a pseudoscience and have both proven totally ineffective in slowing the spread of a not-so-deadly virus.
I would agree that the way the lockdowns have been implemented and the whole COVID kind of situation is a lot more questionable than climate change is, in my opinion anyway. I'm not really as skeptical as most libertarians when it comes to climate change and that whole issue, I suppose. I personally don't really see a link, and I'm not sure if they are trying to link it. Like, temperatures have obviously affected the virus. We were kind of doing, even according to their numbers, no matter whether you believe they're distorted or not, the number of infections and deaths had fallen quite a bit during the summer after the lockdown had ended. And then obviously they picked up again during the winter, as most kind of flu virus types things do. So I'm not really sure you could put 2 and 2 together in like that kind of a sense. But the solutions, I would say, are definitely linked. Because as with climate change, COVID is something that they've tried to solve on a global kind of, maybe not necessarily global at the moment, but kind of, yeah, on a mass scale of the only way we can solve this is through really strong central authority and kind of them taking care of us, and they know what's best kind of a approach. Oh, and one of the things that I read on the World Economic Forum, I think it was, with the Great Reset, is again, not quite like the actual scientific link, but again, their approach. They use the example of how people were really quick to change their lifestyles and were willing to make sacrifices for social health and all that kind of, all those areas in the economy. It felt like more of the experiment, that there's been that conspiracy going around how it's all been, constructed in that way. I don't think it goes as far as that, but kind of them seeing that people are willing to make these sacrifices for like COVID reasons. I can see why they would then go, oh, maybe we can push this towards climate change and implementing the Great Reset and completely redirecting the economy and the way that works. It'll be interesting to see if people do take it that far, because I think the only reason they've been willing to make these sacrifices now was because they were really pushed in this, oh, this is a life and death situation and everyone's going to die. And I mean, people have been dying, obviously. But like you say, the climate change isn't really on top of everyone's agendas as like the top issue. So I think they're hopeful of using similar methods to change the system, if you like. I think we could definitely move towards a more kind of carbon neutral way of living, but definitely not as quickly as they say. Like, for example, with the carbon tax, and especially there's all these emission taxes around London. So if you, if you drive in certain areas, you have to pay extra or whatever. I don't really drive, so I don't know, but exactly. But yeah, it's things like that that will not only make us less competitive necessarily, but also, I think, affect those worst off as usual. It's the, it's the working class and the poorer people who can't really afford hybrid or electric cars. This carbon tax is just going to be a tax on the poor who can't afford to, buy better cars or, work too far away from home to just work or cycle.
Well, even in our government, Boris Johnson has announced an accelerated plan to get rid of petrol and diesel cars. And petrol prices are already through the roof and things like that. I
think there are ways that the government could kind of improve the situation using their power, as in climate change wise. But I would say it would have to be a lot more to do with not subsidizing kind of harmful industries rather than taxing individual people, I guess. Yeah, it doesn't make sense that you've got these taxes to put off individuals from driving their cars or whatever, and then maybe subsidizing green kind of solutions while also upholding, the oil industries and stuff. Loads of our money goes towards that. It just doesn't make any sense.
I suppose it's a hard economic lesson in the sense that you can't buck the market. If people want something, they're going to get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so the next section is on Christmas with COVID. I've got a quote from the Metro here that says, Brits headed out for a big night on the town in what could be the last weekend of semi-freedom for millions. Hundreds were pictured eating and drinking in restaurants, bars and pubs, where people are allowed to meet other households and enjoy alcohol as long as they are outside and have substantial meals. York and Liverpool saw their cities filled with partygoers injecting much needed money into the hospitality sector. Do you think that people and businesses are becoming more accustomed to state intervention and curbs on their liberty? And will this make the restoration of freedom harder to achieve once this issue is over with, since there are so many die-hard adherents to the government's COVID policies?
Well, I definitely, unfortunately, think that it will be quite difficult to get back to normal and restore our freedom, as you say. And I suppose, yeah, people are kind of getting used to government intervention. Hopefully they're not enjoying it, because you want kind of people resistant to this. But I guess as well, they have been limiting what businesses can do. They have also been handing out, like, COVID recovery loans and things like that. So I think it could really go either way. But there's no denying that business has suffered a lot because of their intervention. The article itself said that it was, a much needed injection into the hospitality sector. People definitely want to reopen, I'd say. But yeah, it's not going to be easy. And the fact that they've extended the furlough scheme, I think, to March, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going back to normal anytime soon. I'd say maybe by the summer, the earliest. But even that is probably too hopeful at this stage.
Yeah, Boris has announced that the social distancing measures and things like that are going to be in place until October of next year. So we've got almost another year of this to endure before we're out of it. And that's assuming that the vaccine is in any way effective against the virus. The
interesting thing about the vaccine as well is, I'm not sure if new things have come out since I'd read this, but the effectiveness is like 96%, which is even less effective than the chances of you dying from COVID. So it's like, is there any point? Yeah. And then the people excluded from it as well are people with health conditions and allergies, so people who would be at risk of COVID the most, pregnant women and something else, I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly, but basically all the people who would desperately need the vaccine can't even get it anyway because of health concerns. It's just, yeah, it's so pointless and kind of absurd.
Considering that pubs and restaurants and things like that have been assaulted by this government, there's no other word for it, is it going to be very easy for pubs that have had their last orders and have closed their doors to suddenly bounce back into life? And you've got to remember as well that a lot of these facilities are essentially community hubs and places for socialization, and they're the ones that have been affected worst of all. Do you think we're going to have a more antisocial way of living from now on?
I wouldn't be surprised, especially if it stays at this stage kind of until, like, say, October, like you said, if that's how long they plan on keeping up the social distancing and that. So unless they find some kind of alternative way we can all safely hang out, yeah, I think it's just going to breed a more antisocial society. And you really don't need that, considering how bad mental health is. They said that you can meet up in parks and beaches or whatever, and even in pubs you can meet in outdoor spaces. But I mean, with Tier 3 coming up in London and a lot of the southeast again, you're not even going to be able to have that. So yeah, people are just going to end up isolating themselves more, and I guess staying in their houses reading the scary news all the time.
The Metro article also says England's tiers will be reviewed on Wednesday, so that's when this episode goes out, with London reportedly set to move into Tier 3, as it has the highest infection rate in the UK. Sadiq Khan announced a last-minute campaign to slow the spread of the virus, with coronavirus cops and marshals deployed all over the city to deal with large numbers of people on the streets. The mayor has also organised for more hands, face, space signs all over the capital streets and crowd control barriers. Now, it's pretty duplicitous that Sadiq Khan, who has been a consistent critic of the government's handling of the coronavirus, has been so ready to adopt its slogans and its propaganda. Now, what do you think the dangers are in equating COVID marshals with the police in terms of their role in society? Could we be looking at more social polarisation as more people stand against liberty-destroying policies? And do you think that these marshals are going to help coerce people into having the vaccine?
The kind of most glaring thing to me is that we're moving further and further towards an extreme police state, really. That's, I think, especially, with the constant threat of how bad coronavirus is and how it's only getting worse and how apparently no one is abiding by these rules and it's not making a difference. I can only see them giving the marshals more power, I suppose, or maybe even having the police kind of police this. I was on my way to work a couple of weeks ago there, and there was a guy on the bus without a mask, and they always have the announcement saying that, sometimes the police might come on and inspect to see if everyone's abiding by the social distancing and mask rules. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it was a bit scary to actually see that in real life as opposed to reading about it. But then at the same time, the guy was like, "Oh, I'm exempt," and then the cop just was like, "Oh," and went. So it's very, I'm not really sure what to make of the whole situation. I think on one side they're really scaring us, but on the other they could genuinely implement it and it could get a lot worse. And with all the extra signs they're putting out in the streets to implement social distancing and that. The other thing that gets me about this is how really strict it is, but also kind of half-assed at the same time. So you can't sit next to a stranger on the train for social distancing reasons. Everyone has to have the window seat and you can't sit next to them. But at the same time, it's fine if we're all bunched up like sardines, standing up near the doors, It's just whatever they do, it's just not working, basically.
What are your thoughts on the role state propaganda and political messaging has played during this supposed pandemic? Has its effectiveness gone beyond the obvious fear that has been created? And what could this mean for the future?
Yeah, it's been very obviously used, not just on TV, kind of mainstream media, but social media and everywhere, and posters around town, like you said, with the whole, keep the 2-meter distance and all that, and all their different slogans, save the NHS. And we had, the 2-minute clap for the NHS every Thursday during the summer. That was hilarious. That was a proper Soviet style thing going on there, It's definitely played a huge role during this pandemic. And people have been kind of swallowing it. There was an article a while ago on the BBC about a woman who said she couldn't wear a face mask for psychological reasons. I think her story was that she was a rape survivor, and the mask felt like a hand over her mouth, and it just kind of triggered her into that space again. And people were making fun of her and laugh reacting in the comment section of this article. This is how much, the whole rhetoric has polarized people. They'll become completely insensitive to issues that were, really grave in the past, and suddenly, you can't be exempt at all from this, and, oh, you shouldn't leave your house at all if you can't wear a mask, and all these things. It might move from the pandemic. It's like when we had the war on terror, that whole thing has died down now, and this is the new war on terror. After this, what is it going to be, and is it going to be even more extreme,
So the next section is on Brexit trade talks. I've got a quote from Reuters here which says, Britain is likely to complete its journey out of the European Union in 3 weeks without a trade deal, Prime Minister Boris Johnson and European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen said on Friday. Both sides say they want to agree arrangements to cover nearly $1 trillion in annual trade, but negotiations are at an impasse, with Britain standing to lose zero tariff and zero quota access to the huge European single market. Johnson must decide whether the deal on offer is worth taking, or the future freedom and domestic political benefits afforded by leaving without one outweigh the economic costs. A Brexit without a trade deal would damage the economies of Europe, send shockwaves throughout financial markets, snarl borders, and sow chaos through the delicate supply chains which stretch across Europe and beyond. Do you think we'll leave the transition period with or without a deal on the 31st of December, and why?
I'm never too confident on this because I've had my predictions before, and there'd be times where I was like, yeah, we'll definitely go and, we'll get something sorted. And then instead of leaving with a deal or no deal, it was just another extension. So I wonder if that's what will happen again. I'm less sure of that now. I feel like they think we're, pulling their leg a bit too much, and they'll just have to get rid of us somehow. So I think it's likely that we'll leave with a no deal. I think Boris has already kind of disappointed his voters enough with the way he's dealt with COVID and all that to come out with something that's barely a Brexit in their eyes, at least. So yeah, I think a no deal is probably quite likely at this stage, although probably not ideal in the current economic situation.
Do you think that the economic fallout and the negative economic impacts of Brexit are going to be blamed on COVID-19, considering now is a very opportune time to leave with no deal if the effects are to be bad in the short term?
Yeah, I think it depends on the side as to what's going to be blamed. I think a lot of our folks will definitely blame COVID-19. I think it'll make a huge impact for sure. But yeah, I think the left and all the Remainers will definitely just say this is what it would have been like no matter what, because no deal is no deal, and it's, we can't survive without the EU. The left and the mainstream is definitely just going to blame Brexit itself. But I think that COVID will have a huge part to play. That's undeniable, really, in what's going to happen with the economic fallout after Brexit.
Do you see us trading more with the Commonwealth or with Kanzuk and things like that as opposed to Europe in the future?
That would be most likely, probably, especially if we can sort out some kind of a good trade deal where tariffs are really low or none at all. Yeah, especially if Brussels and Germany kind of stay sour with us, if you like. They kind of act like they want to have a deal with us, but they're very hardline with what they want, and there's very little things they want to sacrifice. So I think there might be a bit of a spite going on there. So I think we probably will likely trade more with the Commonwealth rather than the EU, but we'll see. Yeah.
Well, they were, after all, one of the major proponents of economic sanctions being placed on Britain for simply having voted to leave the EU.
Yeah, exactly.
So it really wouldn't surprise me if they hold a grudge with us forevermore.
I think they will. Hopefully not forever, but for a good few many years, I think.
Is there something to be said for the prospect of short to medium term damage to our nation's finances, or are they just scare stories being put about by proponents of Project Fear, considering that we will likely have a period of currency destabilization as confidence is rocked somewhat and businesses work their way through the new arrangement?
The slight instability is definitely inevitable, especially considering how little we've planned this whole exit. But I think we can get out of it on the other end eventually. One of the interesting things that comes to mind was originally when we voted for Brexit, you'd have all these articles come out, saying, despite Brexit, so-and-so is doing better, or, whatever. I think it might be somewhat similar to that, but again, I think COVID is going to distort that quite a lot because, I think that's going to have a much bigger economic kind of implication on our situation than Brexit would. It's going to add to it for sure. And if we do build up some good kind of trade relations with other countries outside the EU, then it'll probably be better for us in the long run. And of course, there's the sovereignty idea and having more of a say over our own kind of country and borders. I say, I'm a foreigner myself, but There you go. No fan of the EU.
Even if the government's intentions were consistent throughout the Brexit process, and of course we know that they haven't been, could we have had a better Brexit with less uncertainty for a greater number of people if they'd taken their time to do it properly rather than rushing it through to score political points or playing games with people's jobs and businesses?
Yeah, definitely. They should have just had all these discussions before the vote was even kind of put forward to the people. When it originally came out, everyone was so confident that we wouldn't leave. They pretty much didn't bother to think about what we would do if we did. Yeah, I mean, you could see that with just how many leaders we got through in such a short amount of time and how little was achieved with Theresa May, for instance, and I guess even Boris at this stage. Most people who voted for Brexit, if not everyone, probably had a very different kind of vision of what would happen, because we did all think that they had some kind of a plan, that when we did leave we would have, you know, some trade deals already kind of maybe not agreed on, but at least discussed to an almost certain extent. But clearly that didn't happen at all. But yeah, it could have definitely been played out much better if they planned ahead.
Finally, considering it is the last episode of the Libertarian Listener for 2020, what do you think the prospects are for libertarianism in 2021 and beyond?
The main thing will be facing the continuous monster of COVID lockdowns. A lot of people are also complaining and seeing that this can't go on forever. So I think it could also be a good time to kind of spread our message and, I suppose, get more people on side and make them realise that the government doesn't always have your best interest in mind. It's not sustainable, and I think people will see that as time goes on. I'm not sure if any parties will kind of resurface, but I think individuals will become more sceptical of the state and its kind of abilities, I guess, and will see its power as a threat, but also not something that's as necessary as they may have kind of seen before.
Well, after all, we've had one lockdown, and if that was successful, we wouldn't have needed the second one. And if lockdown worked, why have we got to wear face masks? And if face masks work, why have we got to socially distance ourselves? I mean, these are very legitimate questions, and at the end of this year, we're still no closer to having any answers from the government on any of these. Other than that, thank you for joining me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Just for the final few moments of this episode of the Libertarian Listener, I just wanted to go over a few things, my thoughts really on 2020 as a whole. I think 2020 will be looked back upon as a very significant year for the libertarian movement, because it's the year in which we faced our greatest challenge from the authorities, from the establishment, from government, really in a way that we've never had it before. We've seen our rights and our liberties curtailed very significantly, unprecedented for peacetime, and there's certain things going on that may in fact be more equitable with wartime. If you look at some of the legislation that's been passed, it certainly does look very dystopian, and we've got a mountain to climb if we're to really get back to any sort of life that resembles freedom. I think the libertarian movement as a whole has kind of fractured in a sense. There are people who have been vehemently against this lockdown from day one. I've been one of them. There's been people who have been for it and now are against it. There have been people who are against it and are now for it. I think we need to maintain the focus on the issues that we see around us. It's all very well going on about Nazis and adrenochrome and things like that at rallies, but ultimately that's got no bearing on people's lived experience of 2020 and the lockdown and the social distancing and the wearing of masks. It does seem a little bit futile to be bundling every conspiracy theory that's ever been made into COVID, because ultimately you're just diluting what could be a very potent and powerful message that can draw in a greater number of people. I think by and large people are against the idea of having their liberty curtailed. However, in saying that, they've also been complicit in what the state has done with regards to the restriction of freedom. It makes no sense, from my perspective, for a business to close its doors just to avoid a £10,000 fine, when that same business, if it was open for a day on the high street, could in fact cover its fine, its costs in that sense. So it doesn't really make too much sense as to why so many businesses have been complicit in this. I think if we were to target the message that we have towards businesses, business owners, really the backbone of the economy as well, because smaller businesses by and large employ a greater number of people than larger ones. And obviously we've seen the unemployment rising and people going onto the furlough scheme, which is welfare in all but name, and things are just getting worse. The economy is on life support, and we need it to be on its feet and strong again if we're to have any chance of regaining the freedom that we had at the beginning of this year. And I suppose this sort of brings me on to the nub of the matter, because in order to effect any sort of political change, we have to change the culture in which we live. We need to start getting out there in terms of news media, alternative media. We need to get out there in terms of publishing and artistry and music and things like that. Any sort of role that can be an ambassador for change in a political sense or even in a social sense. We need to be aiming for those positions, or else we have nothing to stand upon when it's time to vote, really. And the way things have been going this year, the next vote might be a little further away than we think, but we have to be ready for it. And I'm not one for revolutions. I am much more of a person for evolutionary change. I'm much more for the persuasive power of an argument rather than the coercive power of a government. And I do think that if we applied our efforts more directly in pursuit of what is right and distinguishing that from what is wrong, then we will stand a good chance of having representatives, libertarian, classical liberal representatives, standing in parliament and in councils all over the country, really offering the alternative voice and pushing the merits of freedom and liberty, which have been forgotten almost by the current political class. It's a very important thing that we need, but we have a long journey before we get there. I think 2020 has been the start of that journey in any meaningful sense, because we've now seen the extent the state is going to go or willing to go in the pursuit of tyranny. And on that note, I suppose I will end it there and bid you a Merry Christmas. The Libertarian Listener will be back next year, and I very much look forward to it. And thank you for listening.